On this Friday night, multiplying accusations Russia is using banned weapons. The fresh bombardments, cities under siege as food and supplies run out. Plus, why NATO is rejecting Ukraine's plea for a no-fly zone. Europe's largest nuclear power plant now in Russian control. And criminalizing the news, Russia's latest crackdown on independent media. Crude awakening.
It's ridiculous.
The unprecedented rise in gas prices, why the war is only partly to blame. And steering Ukrainian refugees to safety.
They said, "You're our hero."
The Alberta man in the driver's seat.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. The head of NATO says there is human suffering and destruction on a scale not seen in Europe since the Second World War. And he accused Russia today of using banned weapons.
We have seen the use of cluster bombs. We have seen reports of the use of other types of weapons which will be in violation of international law.
Cluster bombs detonate in midair, scattering munitions and killing indiscriminately. There were fresh pleas from Ukraine for NATO to enforce a no-fly zone over the country. NATO again refused, saying that would risk a full-fledged war in Europe. Well, that prompted an angry reaction from Ukraine's president. Everyone who dies from today will die because of you, said Vladimir Zelensky, because of your weakness. He said refusing the no-fly zone gives Russia the green light to keep bombing. At that nuclear power plant, the fire is now out, but the Russian military is now in control of the plant. The U.S. envoy to the UN says the world narrowly averted nuclear catastrophe. Russian forces continue to make advances. The regions in red on this map show areas now under Russian control in the south, east and north. The arrows show territory still under Ukrainian control, but where Russian troops are advancing, including in areas close to the capital, Kyiv. Our coverage begins tonight with Redmond Shannon.
A high-rise near Kyiv in flames in the moments after it's hit by a shell. As Russia's offensive across Ukraine intensifies and airstrikes hammer major cities. Rockets landing inside the capital too, bewildered citizens wondering where the next one will drop. These are fired at houses all over Ukraine, says this woman. I hate these people. They are not even animals. Across Kyiv, Ukrainians are resisting, digging in, building roadblocks in preparation for what's to come. New satellite images show the 60-kilometre Russian convoy. It remains stalled outside the city. The important Black Sea port of Mariupol is now surrounded by Russian forces. Its mayor says the city has no water or power and food is running low. Thursday's agreement between Ukraine and Russia on humanitarian corridors could soon be tested.
Missiles keep dropping on the civilians.
Calls are constant for a no-fly zone over the country. This councillor organising supplies for soldiers. Many are her friends.
And I decided not to fall down or cry. I decided to help to our army.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky rallied supporters across Europe with a rousing speech Friday, following reports he's survived 3 assassination attempts in the past week. If Ukraine falls, all of Europe will fall, he said. Vladimir Putin addressed neighbouring countries too, urging leaders against new sanctions. Perhaps a sign the measures are working. A third round of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine is set for this weekend, but compromise seems doubtful and peace is for now out of reach. Donna?
Redmond Shannon in London, thank you. Well, after heavy shelling overnight, that fire at Europe's largest nuclear power plant has been extinguished. UN and Ukrainian officials say no radiation was released from the facility located north of Crimea. But with this major plant now under Russian control and 3 others within striking distance, world leaders are accusing Russia of threatening the safety of the entire continent. Ukraine's president called it nuclear terrorism with the potential to have caused much wider damage, including in neighboring Poland. That's where our Mike Armstrong is tonight.
It was something locals had worried about for days.
Hoping to keep the fighting away from the nuclear power plant, civilians had even set up blockades. It wasn't enough. Russian troops attacked overnight in what is being called a first in history, a full-out firefight over a nuclear power plant. Surveillance video appears to show bullets, tracers, and artillery shells being fired. There are also images of a flare lighting up the area. There was a fire that started. It was extinguished. That fire was in a training building, not a part of the plant that produces power.
This is our worst nightmare come true.
This nuclear expert says the world may have dodged a bullet. If a shell had hit in the wrong place or a cooling system had been knocked offline, there could have been a disaster.
I seriously doubt the Russians are targeting nuclear power plants. That would be crazy. But accidents happen in war all the time.
With 6 reactors, the plant is Ukraine's biggest. It's now under the control of Russian forces. The company that operates the facility says its staff is still working, but it is having trouble communicating with them.
We, of course, are fortunate.
According to the International Atomic Agency, none of the reactors were affected and there was no release of radioactive material.
The operator and the regulator been telling us that the situation is naturally continues to be extremely tense.
Russian officials claim their soldiers came under fire from the plant by what they call Ukrainian saboteurs. Now, the Ukrainian president is appealing to the Russian people. In this address, he urged them to remember the 1986 Chernobyl disaster when the two nations fought that catastrophe together. Now, even if this was just part of the Russian advance as it tries to take over more territory and not an actual attack on the plant, it was reckless. Most of the concern about a wider spread in this conflict has been about nuclear war, but with 4 active major nuclear power plants in Ukraine, a nuclear accident is another thing to worry about. Donna?
Certainly is. Mike Armstrong in Poland, thank you. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau today echoed NATO's position, rejecting Ukraine's multiple requests for a no-fly zone over Ukraine.
The thing that we have so far avoided and will continue to need to avoid is putting a situation in which NATO forces are in direct conflict with Russian soldiers. That would be a level of escalation that is unfortunate, that we need to avoid.
The American Secretary of State said today Russia has never been more isolated. The UN Security Council held an emergency meeting today. The European Union said it wants to welcome Ukraine as a member as quickly as possible. Jackson Prosco reports.
Mr. Putin must stop this madness, and he must stop it now.
An emergency meeting of the UN Security Council brought international condemnation of Russia's shelling and seizure of Europe's largest nuclear power plant.
This is the first time that a state has attacked a fueled and functioning nuclear power plant.
Moscow delivered only more defiance.
Another attempt by the Kyiv authorities to kindle artificial hysteria about what is taking place in Ukraine.
There's little sense Vladimir Putin sees reason to change course now, after NATO foreign ministers agreed they will not grant Ukraine's wish to establish a no-fly zone, even as the alliance predicts more bloodshed.
The days to come are likely to be worse, with more death, more suffering, and more destruction.
The West seems to believe Putin may find his invasion unsustainable. Sanctions have pushed Russia's economy to the brink of collapse. Russia's army has suffered heavy losses, and the Kremlin is now censoring news of the war at home.
President Putin totally underestimated the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces, and they have been able to push back, to fight back, and to slow down the Russian advances.
And in defiance of Putin's demands, Ukraine is quickly moving closer to Europe. The EU said it wants Ukraine to become a member as soon as possible, while allies Canada and the United Kingdom were invited to join a meeting of European foreign ministers to shore up support.
Our goal is to make sure that we put maximum pressure on Russia.
Yet Ukraine believes it's not enough to deter Putin's grand ambitions, warning NATO may still have to take up the fight it is so desperate to avoid. Since the start of the invasion, there's been no formal contact between the American military and the Russian military. Fearing this could spiral into direct conflict, the two sides have now established a deconfliction hotline. Donna, the Pentagon says it works. They say they placed a test call and the Russians answered.
Interesting. Jackson Prosko in Washington. Thanks. Russia's neighbors are anxiously watching this war play out. Latvia has NATO troops, including Canadians, on the ground conducting training missions. As Mercedes Stevenson reports from Latvia, the future looks very uncertain.
20 hours at a remote Balkan border crossing in the winter is a lot of time to think. And Dmitry Bykov has had a lot to think about as he waits in a long line of trucks to cross the border into his home country of Russia, hauling a load of goods to Moscow. Bykov used to be in the Russian military. He fears the war he thinks is wrong in Ukraine will see him back in uniform, drafted against his